Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Staeva, Chief Scientific Officer at the Lupus Research Alliance. It's wonderful to have all of you gathered here virtually today for our second live Lupus and COVID-19 What You Need to Know webcast. Now, during our last webcast on April 2nd, we were right in the middle of the hydroxychloroquine shortage issue. There was a lot of concern, confusion, especially amongst people living with lupus. Despite hydroxychloroquine being again in the news this week, the supply issue appears to be abating, at least for the moment, and we will be sharing current data on that today. We are delighted to have a distinguished panel of experts with us who will address your question, and we will share information relevant to people with lupus in the context of COVID-19. We will also fill you in on what the Lupus Research Alliance and our clinical trial division Lupus Therapeutics are doing on behalf of the community to both ensure hydroxychloroquine access for people for lupus and to better understand the burden of COVID-19 in this population within the Lupus Clinical Investigators Network. The goal of the webinar is to bring people with lupus the most up-to-date information and, importantly, to keep things in perspective. New information about COVID-19 is emerging daily, so some of the data that will be shared today is inherently preliminary and evolving. We hope you leave today's webcast understanding some of the research efforts and actions the lupus experts are taking to understand the impact of COVID-19 on people with lupus. So please let me introduce our distinguished panel of experts. Dr. Koretzky is Vice Provost of Academic Integration at Cornell University and Professor of Medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine. He is also Chair of the Lupus Research Alliance's Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. Roberto Caricchio is Professor of Medicine, Chief of Rheumatology, and Director of the Lupus Program at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is also an LRA-funded investigator. Dr. Milena Gianfrancesco is Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. As an epidemiologist, she has been integrally involved with the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance Registry. Dr. Amar Sawala is Professor of Pediatrics and Medicine, Chief of the Division of Pediatric Rheumatology, and Director of the Comprehensive Lupus Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He also is an LRA-funded investigator. And Mr. Albert Roy is the Executive Director of Lupus Therapeutics, an affiliate of the Lupus Research Alliance. Lupus Therapeutics manages the Lupus Clinical Investigators Network, which is a clinical trial network of more than 50 academic sites across North America. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. Thank you also to the webinar attendees for submitting questions to us in advance. The presenters have geared their remarks to address as many of your questions as possible. For any additional inquiries, please use the online chat function during the session, and we will try to address additional questions at the end, time permitting. With that, let's get started. We have a lot to cover. The first question is directed towards Dr. Koretzky. Dr. Koretzky, as the chair of the Lupus Research Alliance Scientific Advisory Board, you recently spearheaded an effort on behalf of the Lupus Research Alliance to assure hydroxychloroquine supply for people for lupus. Could you tell us about this and the subsequent conversation with the FDA? And also, can you share with us the findings from the LRA community survey about access to hydroxychloroquine?
Certainly, Teo. Thank you very much for the introduction. And first, I'd like to just thank all of the participants on this webinar. This is an extremely important event, I think, where the LRA has been able to bring together outstanding investigators in the field of lupus to try to share information. This must be a very frightening time for many of you, and we hope that with information we can make folks feel a little bit better about a number of the issues which you're facing, which we're all facing with this pandemic. I do think that it's important to begin this webinar by really connecting our conversation today with the webinar that was held in April, where the issue around hydroxychloroquine was seen to be very, very acute. All of you are aware of this issue. I have known about hydroxychloroquine for now many, many years, since I was a rheumatology trainee. And I must say that colleagues in medicine, colleagues in the public sector, probably never heard about this drug until quite recently, except of course patients with lupus are very well aware of the drug. And we as rheumatologists were certainly intrigued by the early studies that suggested that hydroxychloroquine might have some impact on the care of patients with COVID-19. As all of you know, I'm sure, there is no proven efficacy yet for Plaquenil in this disease. But in addition to being intrigued by that, there was originally and early on a concern about what might befall patients with lupus, patients who actually rely on this medication. And I was really happy when the LRA reached out and asked, what can we actually do to advocate for our patients? And the method that we chose was to identify colleagues in academic medicine, in industry, in leaders in the rheumatology field, to come together to communicate a concern. And we chose to communicate that concern to the leader of of Health and Human Services, Dr. Alex Azar, to the head of the FDA, Stephen Hahn, and also to Tony Fauci, a household name now, as a leader in the country in thinking about our response to COVID. And we decided, or we thought about the best way to communicate our concerns. And we thought we could get hundreds of signatures of rheumatologists and patients. We thought something that might even be more impactful would be to identify a select group of individuals who are truly leaders in national and international rheumatology, medicine, bioethics. So these include people like the president of Dana-Farber, the dean at Johns Hopkins, individuals who knew each of the three people that we were addressing the letter to personally. We thought that that might have more of an impact. So let me just tell you one thing which I think, and I hope you'll find very reassuring. We reached out to these individuals. Some wrote back in a minute, tells you how much people are looking at their email these days. Others wrote back within a few minutes. Everybody wrote back well before the end of 24 hours. And everybody agreed to sign the letter. Not only that, we drafted the letter and we asked for input, and individuals who are trying to figure out, remember what was going on at the time, they were trying to figure out how their institutions were going to respond to this crisis. And they took time away from that to edit the letter and provide input. So one of the take-home messages I hope you'll feel is that there is a group of physicians, scientists, not just your primary care rheumatologists, but individuals around the country who are absolutely committed to and advocating for patients with lupus, and that won't stop. So what happened? So we sent the letter and we were thrilled with the response. The FDA responded quite quickly. We've had a number of conversations with the FDA, and what the letter said was, we certainly hope that hydroxychloroquine will help patients with COVID, but we also want to make sure that everybody remembers there are individuals who are known to benefit from this drug. And we want to make sure that the supplies are available, and that if it does turn out that Plaquenil is useful for COVID-19, that there is a supply that's reserved for patients who are reliant on that drug. And I do hope, and I'm actually quite confident, that the message was heard. I do want to just close my few minutes to mention the other thing that the LRA has been doing, which I think is really important, and that is to try to get a sense of how our community, our patients, are dealing with this potential or perhaps real shortage of Plaquenil. So to address that, a survey was conducted by the LRA, and more than 330 individuals completed the survey. And what's incredibly reassuring, and these are individuals from across the country, is that nearly everybody is still able to get Plaquenil if they need it. Now, sometimes it takes a little bit more effort to get it. Sometimes you don't get the length of supply that you're used to. But the other message that I'd like to give you is that don't despair. Try to get the drug. The drug is important for you and to manage your disease. And at least our experience so far is that it's possible to get the drug, that we're not hearing that people are unable to do so. So in closing, I just want to mention that we'll stay in touch. The LRA will stay in touch. That as this crisis hopefully abates and supplies ease up, then we'll be working with you on other things. But until then, this is something that is high on the radar. And if there are concerns or questions, please turn to the LRA for help. Thank you, Teo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koretzky, for this very encouraging update. And the Lupus Research Alliance will certainly continue to monitor the situation very closely, and we will continue to do everything possible to assure supply for hydroxychloroquine for people with lupus. For now, we are thankful that the situation was resolved relatively quickly due to manufacturers stepping up production, and also due to advocacy efforts such as yours, Dr. Koretzky, and the broader advocacy efforts by the LRA, ACR, and others. My next question is for Dr. Caricchio. Dr. Caricchio, as a rheumatologist on the front line of the COVID-19 pandemic, you have treated more than 160 patients with this disease since the outbreak. And it has become evident that poor outcomes in COVID-19 correlate with features of cytokine storm syndrome, in which high degree of inflammation and multi-organ disease arise through excessive release of molecules called cytokines. And this whole process is driven by uncontrolled immune activation. And this type of an overreactive immune response is often seen in lupus. You contributed to the only textbook on cytokine storm syndrome, where you actually wrote the chapter on lupus. And you recently authored a study in the journal Arthritis and Rheumatology, extrapolating from clinical experience in cytokine storm syndromes to inform the care of critically ill patients with COVID-19. So can you give us a firsthand account of the parallels and differences in overreactive immune responses in lupus and COVID-19? And also, can you give us a sense of why some of the drugs used to treat lupus and other rheumatic diseases are now being tested as therapeutic approaches for COVID-19?
Sure. Thank you, Theo, for having me this evening. This, as Gary mentioned already, this is a tremendously important webinar for all our lupus patients. I'm pretty sure that they're all worried about of their disease or their care that they have the lupus disease. So as you mentioned, I'm a rheumatologist, and in a pandemic of time, I'm actually interested in lupus renal disease and how infections, specifically bacterial infections, impact the pathogenesis and possibly impact also flares. And as you mentioned, I have an interest in macrophage activation syndrome. And so at the beginning of March, I reached out to the chair of our lung center because he had already organized a series of structured to make up for the amount of patients that we were anticipating to get. And the reason why I reached out to him is because the medications that were coming from the first wave in China that they were used, and then later on in Italy specifically, were medications that we use in rheumatic diseases. And so I, especially back then, hydroxychloroquine. And so I offered my help early on. And I must say that I was fortunate that, relatively speaking, that he was very inclusive, because he allowed me and my section, my division, to really embrace the cytokine storm that develops in a percentage of those patients. And so what we did, we organized at Temple a series of lab works that were done on day 0 and then every day, so that we can actually we're able to capture the cytokine storm early on and treat it early on, either in clinical trials, as we have many, or outside of clinical trials, by nevertheless using similar medications that were already in clinical trials. And so we started mid-March. Now at this point, actually, we close to 300 patients treated with for the cytokine storm, and half of them are outside trials and half of them are in trials. But I must admit that within the first 10 days, and back then, the first half of March and first week of April, we were getting roughly 40 to 50 patients a day admitted for COVID-19 infection. I realized that the storm that I was waiting for, the one that I knew from the cytokine storm that develops in lupus or in juvenile idiopathic arthritis, was different, was actually very different. The markers that I was expecting to be extremely elevated in what's called macrophage activation syndrome, which is the hyperinflammatory response that occurs in lupus, were not there. We're not actually in these COVID-19 manifestations. They were elevated, but nothing like at the extent of what happens in macrophage activation syndrome, such as in lupus. On the other hand, some markers that we know were elevated in lupus are much more elevated in the cytokine storm that occurs in COVID-19. And one of them, which maybe some in our audience have heard of, is the D dimer. The D dimers in COVID-19 are extremely elevated and indicate the risk of blood clots. That is not the case, for example, in macrophage activation syndrome in lupus. They're not as elevated. So there were many differences, but there were also similarities. And especially in some of the manifestations in the tissue, such as, for example, what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is a manifestation that occurs relatively frequently in COVID-19 patients and is thought to be secondary to this tremendous increase of cytokines in the systemic body, but also in the lung, which then leads to damage of the endothelial cells and epithelial cells. There is a commonality between lupus patients with macrophage activation syndrome and patients with COVID-19. One other similarity, for example, that has emerged early on from China, but also from Europe and then now from the United States, is the sizable percentage of patients with COVID-19 who present with what's called acute kidney injury. So now why I mentioned this particular aspect of COVID-19 infection? Because one is part of the storm. It is thought to be the elevation of those cytokines that then lead to the damage in the kidney, but also it's something that for rheumatologists that take care of lupus patients in the hospital, possibly with the COVID-19 infection, it is important to be on the alert, so to speak, because quite a fraction of our lupus patients have already some kidney damage due to the lupus nephritis. So it's something that we should keep in mind if the patient has lupus and COVID-19, and perhaps anticipate with the specific treatment for the lupus nephritis on top of what the patient is coming with the COVID-19. And so in terms of lupus patients, what we have so far is not a lot of data. We have some data on lupus patients. In my center, actually, I did not have any lupus patient with COVID-19 admitted to the hospital. We had 2 discoid lupus patients, not the full lupus patient, and we had other rheumatic diseases that had the concomitant COVID-19, but no lupus patients. That doesn't mean that lupus patients are protected. It's just by chance that didn't happen because we had vasculitis, scleroderma, dermatomyositis. So we did have those, and they will be reported in the Global Rheumatology Initiative. But what I would say is that from France, we have a report on 17 patients and with lupus and COVID-19, and they were seriously ill by COVID-19. And one aspect that is important was that many of them have actually renal disease, which was aggravated by the COVID-19 itself. So it's something to watch. We need more data for sure to understand how we can approach lupus and COVID-19, but certainly lupus patients can get the disease. And if I had lupus, I would not consider myself protected, but actually I would be even more cautious. And in conclusion, because I want to leave time to my esteemed colleagues, I would say that the 2 storms are different, are very different. They might end up with a similar manifestation, such as in the lung or in the kidney, but they are different. And because of that, I think is also relatively easy for the caregivers, for the physicians in the hospital, to be able to distinguish them so that the right treatment can be given. And of course, they should call the rheumatologist for consult. And thank you. I'll be happy to answer the rest of the questions later.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Caricchio. That's a really very helpful explanation. It's really been fascinating to see how the COVID-19 pandemic has brought more awareness to lupus. And I personally hope that the vast ongoing research on COVID-19 may ultimately also lead to insights that could advance lupus research. I just wanted to mention on a related topic, as most of you are aware, May is Lupus Awareness Month, and the Lupus Research Alliance launched a new campaign called Learn from Lupus, which features, amongst other resources, a mini class series with Dr. Shayla Shorter. And her video on what happens when the immune system overreacts is particularly relevant to Dr. Caricchio's discussion. And I encourage the lay members of the audience to see it on our website at lupusresearch.org. My next question is for Dr. Gianfrancesco. As an epidemiologist, you have been intimately involved with the establishment of the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance Registry and are now closely monitoring and analyzing its emerging data. Now, the speed with which this effort was launched is truly remarkable. In less than a week, the Alliance developed online reports, case report forms, portals to enable healthcare providers around the world to enter information on individuals with rheumatic disease who also have COVID-19. And also within a week of launching, the registry had collected data on over 100 patients. A month ago, you published in the journal Lancet Rheumatology the initial data from the registry. So could you please tell us what is the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance and what are its findings telling us, at least up to this point? We received many questions from the webinar participants about whether people with lupus are at an increased risk of developing COVID-19 and or of having a worse outcome. Many also wondered whether hydroxychloroquine has any protective or therapeutic effects in COVID-19. So please tell us about your research and the relevant findings for the lupus community.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the registry. I'm really excited to share our findings. You're right that the motivation and the speed of the registry forming really came from this urgent need on information on patient care for individuals with all different rheumatic diseases, such as lupus, that were being diagnosed with COVID-19, because there was really no information at the time as this pandemic was unfolding. And rheumatologists were really unsure how to treat patients. We know that patients with rheumatic diseases are at higher risk of serious infections in general due to certain medications. They're also more likely to have comorbidities. And in the general population of COVID-19 outcomes, we were seeing poor outcomes with people with comorbidities. But on the other hand, some medications used to treat rheumatic diseases were also being explored as potential treatments for COVID. So it was really unknown how patients would fare in this pandemic. So we built this registry in a week while, here in California, we were sheltering in place. And so a lot of these meetings happened online with people all around the world at strange hours of the night. But I think within a week, we launched with a parallel data entry point with our European colleagues. But together we pool our results to be able to share with the community weekly online and in such publications as you described. So I'd like to quickly share results of our most recent data analysis, which has been accepted and should be out soon in Annals of Rheumatic Disease. And that's on the first 600 patients entered into the registry. Since then, now I'll just note that we have information on over 1,600 patients from over 40 different countries, and you can learn more and see those weekly updates on rheum-covid.org. But getting back to those results, in our first 600 patients, we saw that a majority of cases were female and under 65 years old. similar to the general populations of patients with rheumatic disease. And we had a number of different diseases represented, but rheumatoid arthritis and lupus were the most common. Surprisingly, 80% of patients were in remission or had low disease activity at the time of COVID diagnosis. The top comorbidities we saw were the same as those in the general population of COVID patients, so hypertension, lung disease, and diabetes. We had patients on hydroxychloroquine and other disease-modifying therapies, biologics, and combination therapies. We found that half of patients that were reported to the registry were hospitalized, and less than 10% died, indicating that most patients do recover and do well. Because these are only cases of COVID and patients with rheumatic disease, we really can't say anything about risk, right? We don't have information on people who weren't diagnosed. So we can just really look at outcomes that are reported, understanding that we might be seeing more of the severe outcomes. We're not going to see people who are asymptomatic until testing strategies change. So with that caveat, we were interested in factors that were predicting who was hospitalized with COVID. And we found factors such as age over 65 years and comorbidities such as hypertension, lung disease, and diabetes were associated with being hospitalized, which is very similar to what's being seen in studies of COVID in the general population. We did not see any single rheumatic disease being more associated with being hospitalized than another. Lupus patients were slightly more overrepresented in the hospitalized group, but this difference wasn't significant. And this could be possibly due to having more comorbidities more than the disease itself. We did not see any specific disease-modifying therapies or medications associated with an increased risk of being hospitalized, which is reassuring for patients. We did find that moderate to high doses of glucocorticoids or steroids were associated with an increased risk of hospitalization. And this is very similar to what is known about other infections. So our results suggest that patients should continue taking their medications as suggested by the American College of Rheumatology guidelines. And I also want to note that we did not find hydroxychloroquine to be protective against being hospitalized for COVID. And I'll also share results of a small sub-analysis we did on lupus patients that was reported in a letter recently. We looked at 80 patients with lupus in the registry, and we found that 64% were taking hydroxychloroquine prior to SARS-CoV-2 infection. And we did not see a difference in hospitalization status between those on hydroxychloroquine versus those not on hydroxychloroquine. And there were no differences in maximum level of care, so people needing supplemental oxygen or ventilation between the two groups. So we really don't see evidence of a protective effect on this medication, at least in the data that is reported to the registry. And our future research steps really want to look at more detailed outcome. We want to look at predictors of ventilation status and mortality with a larger number of patients, and also do a US specific analysis as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gianfrancesco. It's very exciting data, and it certainly will be interesting to hear even more as you amass information from larger number of patients as well. Now let me turn to Dr. Sawala, whose research program focuses on revealing genetic and epigenetic contributions to the development of systemic autoimmune and inflammatory diseases. Last month, you published a study partially supported by the Lupus Research Alliance in the journal Clinical Immunology, examining epigenetic changes in lupus patients and the risk of COVID-19. So first of all, could you please explain briefly for the lay members of our audience what is epigenetics, and then please tell us about your findings and their implications for people with lupus during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And starting off with the epigenetics, the concept of epigenetics really comes from factors that happen on top of the DNA sequence or on top of the genes that then determine the regulation and the level of expression of these genes. So all of our cells have the same set of genes. But what makes one cell express some of these genes and not others is primarily determined by epigenetics. So in a sense, epigenetic mechanisms are mechanisms that put brakes on gene expression. And depending on how hard the brake is, you can decide whether or not you will completely suppress the gene from being expressed, or maybe modulate the level of expression to the levels that are needed for that specific cell. And so there are several mechanisms that we call epigenetic mechanisms that do that. And one of these is called DNA methylation. So it's basically a chemical modification that happens to the gene that tells the gene you need to stop being expressed. And so how is this relevant to lupus, and how is this relevant to COVID-19? It turns out that lupus patients have a defect in these epigenetic mechanisms, the brake mechanisms that silence genes. And specifically, DNA methylation is defective. And as a result of that, some of the genes can get overexpressed, or in a sense, abnormally expressed. That leads to hyperactivation of certain cells and leads to some pathogenic consequences or mechanisms that might produce the disease in lupus. And so the virus SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, uses a receptor on the cell surface called ACE2. And it uses that to enter into the cells. It turns out that ACE2, that receptor, is actually controlled by the level of DNA methylation, which I just mentioned. And so when we looked at lupus cells, and this is in blood cells, we found that the methylation defect extends to the ACE2 gene, meaning that the ACE2, the brakes that the body puts on the ACE2 gene are defective in lupus. So this receptor for the virus is more expressed in lupus cells. So in theory, then lupus cells are more likely to be infected because the receptor itself is overexpressed. And we were able to show that in several different cell types in lupus. And so in a sense, based on this, we think that lupus patients might be, at least from the epigenetic perspective, more susceptible to get infected with SARS-CoV-2. And that's why we wanted to be cautious and make sure that lupus patients practice social, or what we like to call here physical distancing, wear masks, wash hands frequently. There's a reason to be cautious because of this epigenetic defect. And so what happens is that in lupus as well, if you get an infection, and that's one of the questions I think that were asked, if lupus patients get an infection, they're more likely to get a disease flare. And this is in part because infection induces oxidative stress, and oxidative stress exacerbates the DNA methylation defect I mentioned earlier. So if you get an infection, you're more likely to get a flare. And it turns out also that lupus flares and the oxidative stress also exacerbate DNA methylation. So it becomes like a cycle, a vicious cycle of infection, flare, demethylation, and so on. And so it is very important, we think, that we make everything we can to keep lupus patients in remission. We advocate that patients continue to take their medications, as was mentioned earlier, because from this perspective, of course, there are other reasons why they should do that, but from this perspective, keeping the disease in remission will prevent further demethylation or removal of these brakes on this COVID-19 virus receptor in the cells. And then at the same time, we discussed the cytokine storm. We are concerned because some of the same genes that are expressed, or some of these cytokines that we see in cytokine storm patients with COVID-19 are already demethylated or hypomethylated, meaning that they're already more likely to be expressed in lupus patients because of an inherent epigenetic defect. And so we don't want our lupus patients to get a flare and get COVID-19, because we think that they're more likely in this case to get a more severe disease. And if you look at the series we have so far, that are published, I mean, there's a reason for us to be concerned. So, putting this into context, I mean, lupus patients, in my opinion, based on the epigenetic data that we have, in theory, are more likely to get COVID-19, and we don't know if this is going to be true or not. but there's enough reason for us to be cautious and to advocate for our patients to practice physical distancing, wear a mask, and wash their hands frequently. There's also increased comorbidities, which was mentioned. Some of these comorbidities we see more frequently in lupus patients, hypertension, kidney disease, and others that are associated with more severe COVID-19 disease course. And also our patients are on medications, immunosuppressive medications. We don't know for sure that immunosuppressive medications will increase the severity of COVID-19, but until we do, we have to be very cautious. One thing I'd like to mention is that lupus patients, regardless of the immunosuppressive medications that they might be taking, they're inherently more susceptible to viral infections. We know that for many years. We know that there is a defect in some of the immune cells, specifically the CD8 positive T cells, for example, that fight viral infections. And so putting this all together, we just want to make sure that our lupus patients stay safe, advocate social distancing, and also make sure that they continue to take their medications to prevent disease flares that will exacerbate the disease itself and also increase their likelihood of getting infections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sawala, for this very clear explanation of your research and also for putting it in context for people with lupus during this time. Your point about the importance of maintaining disease remission, especially during the pandemic, is essential for people with lupus to keep in mind and to try to attain as much as possible. My last question, before we take questions submitted through the chat, is from my colleague, Mr. Albert Roy. Notwithstanding the critical work and important information coming out of the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance that Dr. Gianfrancesco described, when it comes to lupus in the face of COVID-19, there's many questions that really remain unanswered or only partially answered. So can you tell us about the study being planned by Lupus Therapeutics to understand the burden of COVID-19 in people with lupus within the Lupus Clinical Investigators Network? And can you also highlight importantly how the Lupus Therapeutics study is different and complements the effort of the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance that Dr. Gianfrancesco discussed?
Sure, thanks, Teo. So, we have looked very carefully at what has been done to date as it relates to COVID-19 research within the general rheumatology community, for which a few examples have been highlighted this evening. And fortunately, Lupus Therapeutics is uniquely positioned to sort of further evaluate the implications of the pandemic, but to chart a course that is complementary to the ongoing research that's been undertaken, and most importantly, I think remains laser focused on lupus on a far broader scale that has otherwise been pursued to date. And we really can accomplish such an undertaking through our Lupus Clinical Investigators Network, or LuCIN, which is North America's largest lupus clinical research enterprise. And it's composed of 57 academic medical research centers that actively follows more than 20,000 people living with lupus. So over the course of the next several months, a clinical study sponsored by the Lupus Research Alliance will be conducted within LuCIN. And our goal is to more broadly evaluate the burden and how common COVID-19 is among people living with lupus within the LuCIN patient population. Additionally, given there's a lot of press around the prescription of anti-malarial drugs, such as hydroxychloroquine or anti-inflammatory medicines to treat COVID-19, and in consideration that many people living with lupus take these same medications as part of their own clinical care, we will further analyze very deeply whether taking these types of medicines actually improves or worsens or doesn't affect COVID-19 outcomes in people living with lupus. This will be examined in relationship to an individual's home environment, what their social habits are, or what their occupational experience is. So while this initiative on the surface seems very similar to the Global Rheumatology Alliance's outstanding efforts to date, I would like to emphasize that our effort is complementary in that we are looking at the burden and prevalence of COVID-19 in the largest number of well-characterized lupus patients in the United States and Canada. There is no other group of lupus centers in North America with the number of people living with lupus followed by LuCIN. And really finally, Teo, I just want to underscore that the core ingredient to make all of these research initiatives that were highlighted today a success is that is really the active involvement from the lupus community. You know, I hope those of you who are listening to this evening, if given the opportunity, that you'll be an active participant in any of these initiatives that we're talking about tonight, or anything that happens going forward, so that the information that is ultimately shared in the public domain related to COVID-19 is grounded in the best science, so that all of us have a level of confidence and comfort in what we are hearing. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that come from the participants. Thanks, Teo.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. This is an exciting study that could offer some wonderful synergies with the Global Rheumatology Alliance Registry. And I very much look forward to seeing the outcomes of both of these important initiatives. I also want to underscore the point that you made about the critical role people with lupus play in these registries and in research overall. So if you're interested in participating and contributing, please visit our website for more information. So we now have time for a few questions from the audience. I apologize in advance if we're not able to answer all of the questions that have been submitted. However, we will continue to address many of the queries that were posed today in the Lupus Research Alliance communications. So please check our website and also sign up for our weekly emails and social media posts. So the first question goes back to our earlier discussion about hydroxychloroquine, the most prescribed medication for lupus, and that it has been used as treatment for COVID-19, particularly during the start of the pandemic. Many of our viewers want to know how does hydroxychloroquine work and what are its mechanisms of action. So I wonder if one of our rheumatologists can address this question.
I can mention a couple, and then maybe Dr. Zavala can mention another couple, and Gary another couple, because the mechanisms by which hydroxychloroquine works are really many. The one that is most accepted and most common is the fact that by accumulating in the cell, in certain parts of the cell, changes the pH inside certain structures that then activate cytokine release, activate the cell itself, and that's the primary mechanism by which, at least in lupus might work. And I might leave to Dr. Zavala the part that is thought to be important in COVID-19 instead.
Okay, well, in lupus, I concur with what you mentioned. So it does affect the acidification of some of these receptors that signal when they bind to antigens. Lupus patients have double-strand DNA antibodies and antibodies against ribosomal or other proteins and RNAs. And so the reason why these antibodies develop is because our body recognizes these antigens as foreign and elicits an immune response against them. And so hydroxychloroquine interferes with several of these receptors that recognize these other antigens and dampens the immune response that way. In terms of how it works in COVID-19, I actually don't think it works in COVID-19. And, we don't have evidence that it does so far.
Well, there are some hints of inhibiting viral replication, and there are some hints with machine learning studies, and then there are studies in vitro, but I'm glad that our patients with lupus now, they can mostly find hydroxychloroquine, given the data that we are accumulating. We know it works in lupus.
It does, and it's very important that our lupus patients stay on it to prevent lupus flares and to prevent complications from lupus. But I don't think it protects from COVID-19.
Great, thank you both. So the next question, also on the topic of hydroxychloroquine, this time looking at the side effects of hydroxychloroquine that have been widely discussed in the media and have raised concerns amongst people with lupus who have been on Plaquenil for some time. Could you please put these safety issues in perspective for people with lupus?
I'm invested in that actually, because our lupus patients might be now scared of actually taking hydroxychloroquine from what they heard on the news and maybe in scientific papers that actually has a number of side effects, especially myocardial side effects by prolonging, so to speak, the heartbeat. Now, this is very important to understand that the perspective is that we do not use the medication like has been used in COVID-19 patients by any stretch of imagination. Those are extremely ill patients, very ill patients. They tend to have at older age, by far older age, actually, probably twice as much as the peak of lupus patients population. They have a number of comorbidities that lupus patients might not have, and they have gone through twice as many years in their lives. So, and they acutely are getting it in a situation in which they are hyperinflamed. So it's a very different situation in which these patients take this medication, which by far is the safest we have in rheumatology. And I'm pretty sure my colleagues would agree that among the many medications that unfortunately we are forced to use, hydroxychloroquine is probably the safest. And it remains the safest under our conditions in which we use it, not in the conditions of the COVID-19 patients.
Maybe I'll just add to that. You all know that there are no medications without side effects. And we live with that, that medications that we use are chosen because the potential for benefit outweighs the concerns. And that is absolutely true for hydroxychloroquine and lupus, that the risks and the concerns that you hear about now in the news come about because so many patients now are taking this drug. And as Roberto mentioned, many of the patients are patients who are very ill to start with other problems that the virus itself has cardiac effects. So it's very plausible to consider that what you might see as toxicities of any medication could be exacerbated. So I do hope that the message is clear, especially for patients who have been taking Plaquenil for a while and have done well with it, to stay on the drug because the drug has been shown to be beneficial. And as Roberto mentioned, it's one of the drugs that rheumatologists prefer to use because of the safety profile.
Thank you both. Another question is, if is there a potential protective effect of being on immunomodulators for treatment of lupus from going to more severe complications in COVID-19? From the experience of the rheumatologist, what can you tell us about this? Is there enough information also for us to even conclude that?
Well, you know, we don't have enough information. That's basically what it comes down to. It really is important that our patient, the most important thing for our patients to remember is that they need to stay on their medications to prevent their disease from relapsing or from lupus, for lupus to become active. I don't think there's, some of these medications that we use in rheumatology have been used and are now in clinical trials in COVID-19 patients, but we don't have conclusive evidence yet. And we don't think we can make a statement that just being on this medication before you get the infection will prevent you from getting a more severe COVID-19. It's just, there's just not enough data to answer that question. But most importantly is our patients need just to stay on their medications to prevent lupus from flaring.
The American College of Rheumatology has actually placed guidelines for rheumatologists and how to behave or what to do under those circumstances. And despite it is the American College of Rheumatology, which is our official guide, it is a recommendation. It is based mostly on the common sense that we would have, like Dr. Zawala said, stay on your medications, avoid flares, because a flare puts everything else at risk. So for now, yes.
Thank you. Another question for which, again, I'm not sure there's enough information, but would love to hear from you is whether there are differences in health outcomes in racial and ethnic minorities in people with lupus who also have COVID-19. What has been your experience, and can you share with us any insights about this, or at least what is being done to address those types of questions?
So the data is that minorities are more at risk. Not more at risk. They have worse manifestations of COVID-19. The first data came from New York, actually, because they had the first dramatic wave. And we do see that as well. So as common sense, I would think that because of many of our patients are minorities, African Americans or Hispanic, then that puts them more at risk of more serious COVID-19 disease. Are they more at risk of COVID-19 disease? I cannot really say that. I cannot really tell. I don't know. But theoretically, as Dr. Zavala said, it might be that because of their minority status, then they might be more at risk of more serious consequences from the disease.
I will add that we're beginning to look at this, at least with the US specific data and the Global Rheumatology Alliance Registry. And hopefully we'll be presenting something at an upcoming conference, the ACR conference.
Great, that would be very important. Thank you both. Another question was whether the medications that lupus patients are on interfere with testing of the virus or antibodies to it.
I don't know of any evidence that taking any of the medications that we use for patients with lupus, for use in patients with lupus, will interfere in the standard tests that we use for the virus, which is getting a sample and then looking for evidence of the viral nucleic acid. And similarly, if you mount an antibody response, that should still be measured and measurable in patients who are taking medications for lupus.
We have a few more minutes. I think this was addressed to a certain extent by Dr. Caricchio earlier, but it's a question that's come up. So maybe just to clarify further for our audience, what symptoms do lupus patients with COVID-19 experience, and how can one differentiate between symptoms of a lupus flare versus symptoms of COVID-19 infection?
Well, that's obviously it's an important question. So I can only gather my answer from what has been published so far and what COVID-19 manifests with and what lupus flares manifest with. Now, lupus flares can be such a variety of manifestations, from renal disease to fluid around the lungs to chest pain. So there are a lot of manifestations that lupus might have during flares, and that depends really on the lupus type. And I'm pretty sure that our patients in the webinar, they know very well their own lupus and when it's flaring. What I can say, though, that there is a classic triad, there are classic manifestations of the COVID-19 infection, which might help then think about if that is actually lupus or not. And there is sudden shortness of breath, fever, cough, and headache. These group of signs and symptoms seem to manifest almost universally in patients that are infected acutely by COVID-19. And again, it's cough, shortness of breath, headache, and fever. That's a very, very, very classic. And it might be very different from many, many types of lupus flares.
Thank
now,
you.
there is a fraction of patients that also had a stomach upset in COVID-19 patients. It is a fraction, but it is a sizable number. But again, they would also have the cough, the fever, the shortness of breath, and headache. Now, generally speaking, patients with lupus who experience sudden shortness of breath and fever, they tend to call their rheumatologist or go to the emergency room because they know it is something serious. So either way, they'll find out. But that's the classic manifestation of COVID-19.
Teo, if I can just add one thing, so that if there is a patient with lupus who has symptoms that might make them concerned about COVID-19, don't attribute that to a lupus flare, just because it might be also similar to something that you might have experienced with lupus. It would be very important to talk to your physician or the local health department so that if you feel like you need a test for COVID, that you have the test done, if at all possible, in where you live.
Thank you. Thank you, both very important. Last two questions. One is looking more optimistically towards the future and the time when there will be a vaccine against COVID-19. The question that was posed from the audience is, when a vaccine is created, will it be safe for people with lupus to take? And maybe you could address the issue of having live attenuated vaccines for lupus or non-live vaccines.
Yeah, it really will depend on what the nature of the vaccine that will be developed and that will be successful in clinical trials and available is, right? Because if it was an inactivated vaccine or a recombinant vaccine, or even a messenger RNA vaccine, which we've heard about, to my knowledge, these should be safe in lupus patients. Obviously, if it was a live attenuated vaccine, then we have to be very cautious. But I think it's something that we'll have to wait and see what is the nature of the vaccine that will eventually become successful.
Great, thank you. So the final question is, how can people with lupus stay safe amid COVID-19? That's a question that was repeatedly posed. When can they return to work, to see family again, to resume their activities? What are, as final thoughts, some parting guidance for people with lupus? How can they stay safe?
Well, personally, I would say that it really depends on the type of medications that they are taking. Because there are lupus patients that might be only on very mild medications, immunosuppressive medications, but there are other patients that might be on very important medications that really immunosuppress their capacity to respond to infections. And lupus patients would know that, of their own severity of disease and the status. So they definitely should use the same social distance and same precautions that everybody else is using. And I wish actually everybody else, because not everybody else is, and we should be more compliant. But for those that are, for example, those that have lupus nephritis or organs disease that require the rounds of immunosuppressive therapy, for example, Cytoxan, who's very immunosuppressive, they might be a little bit more at risk, and they might try to find a solution with their employer to have a longer time in, for example, working from home. That's what, for example, we are doing at Temple. We are not everybody is at work. We have redeployed individuals who might be at more risk of infections, such as those that have those particular medications. And so they've been redeployed to work at home rather than in the hospital. Of course, the hospital is a risky place, but I don't think that the supermarket is particularly less safe. Nobody is wearing a mask. So I would be much more cautious if I were a lupus patient, and especially if I had on board medications that truly immunosuppress. And I would find it possible to have an arrangement with my employer if the home working from home is an option until the situation will be safer. Eventually we'll be safer. Eventually we'll have a vaccine. Eventually we'll move on.
Thank you, Dr. Caricchio. So we are out of time. I hope that this has been helpful and informative for people with lupus. And I'm really delighted to see such a strong interest based on the number of people who've joined us and also all the questions that were submitted both before and during this webinar. Please note that a recording of this webinar will be available early next week on lupusresearch.org. And finally, Drs. Koretzky, Caricchio, Gianfrancesco, Sawala, and Mr. Roy, thank you indeed for giving us so much valuable information today. And thank you for all you do on behalf of the lupus community. It is wonderful to hear about the ongoing research and the clinical efforts to guide the lupus community during this challenging time. And your comments also underscore the incredible complexity of the immune system, as well as the importance of research. I want to thank all of you on the audience for joining us today and for your ongoing generous support of the Lupus Research Alliance. To all of you, be safe and be well.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.